Five of the Best is an opinion-based series on films which I have seen released during the chosen year. This is to celebrate previous years in film, not to cause any offence. All opinions are my own. Hi everyone, welcome back to 5 of the Best, the series in which we celebrate movies year by year. This series consists of me discussing my 5 favourite films of this chosen year. This video we're discussing the year 2013, so let's get started. Before we get into our top 5, here are a few honourable mentions for this year. The Great Gatsby, Gravity, Coherence, Dallas Buyers Club, The World's End, Lone Survivor, The Hobbit, The Desolation of Smaug, Now You See Me, Evil Dead, Her, and Rush. Now, let's get on to the list and start with number 5. Captain Phillips is directed by Paul Greengrass and stars Tom Hanks and Barkhad Abdi. So to start this year, we have a great Tom Hanks film. Always a good start to any year. I'm talking about the great movies of that year. There's always a good shout, there's always a good chance, I should say, that Tom Hanks is in some form or another going to appear on a 5 of the Best, especially around this time. But Captain Phillips is probably one of the ones that you and I would remember the most, certainly in the early 2010s, that Tom Hanks really stands out in. And to be honest, that's more down to the scenario, the plot, and the whole situation of Captain Phillips. This film, and I don't describe many films like this, but I think you'll understand if you've seen the film when I say that by the end of Captain Phillips, you are, as an audience member, exhausted. Not only the characters in the film, Tom Hanks especially as the captain, the trials and tribulations that he has to go through in this scenario, and of course it's based on a true story, which is so surreal to even think, but of course it's believable. It's believable that a scenario as scary. You know, there's moments in this film when it's a lot more terrifying than some horror films. And that really conveys so well, and it shows, because Tom Hanks in a lot of his performances, say something like in Saving Private Ryan, for example, where he has to be a tough, stoic commander. And you would think as a captain of a ship, you would have to be similar to that. But especially as this film reaches its final act, Tom Hanks does a brilliant conveyance of just a man breaking down. The pressure to be hard-willed and strong-headed, and eventually just he is defeated not in the sense of the story beat, but defeated by the actions that he's had to commit and the scenario that he's had to play out in, and he's living completely on adrenaline, and that carries through to us as the audience members as well. It feels so, as I say, we feel exhausted by the time of the end of Captain Phillips rolls along. And another performance in here, we always talk about Tom Hanks, but he's always supported so well in his best performances by the supporting cast. And Barkhad Abdi, who I am not too familiar of, you will know him as I'm the Captain Now. That's of course who that is, and that's the most famous scene and most famous line from this film, and probably the one that people remember the most. But for me personally, I find that Captain Phillips, I think there was maybe this kind of I don't know where this came, but it was this kind of feeling that Tom Hanks had his great. He had his great period, and you know, the kind of late 90s, early 2000s with, you know, things like Forrest Gump, things like Toy Story, things like Saving Private Ryan, a lot of variety, but he really was brilliant in everything. But it got to this part where I don't really know where it came from, but this kind of feeling that, no, I think Tom Hanks has had his time now, which does happen to so many directors. But Captain Phillips was the one that was like, hang on a minute, Tom Hanks has not lost a beat. in ways he's grown so much and matured so much as an actor. And this was one that conveyed so much of what I, as a fan of Tom Hanks, really love about his performances. Because in the variety, and Forrest Gump, which is obviously one of his shining glories, it is one of my favourite films of all time. I think I've mentioned that before on the series. And that one in particular showed a different kind of conveyance of emotion, a different kind of maturity to perform as that character, as Forrest. Whereas in Tom Hanks, as Captain Phillips in this, his conveyance of emotion, his conveyance of strong when he needs to be, but vulnerable when he's on his own, or vulnerable when he can be, that was what really stuck with me in this film, and that range and that variety of performance throughout the film, and, you know, being up to the task at hand. And I suppose that's a testament to the real Captain Phillips and the true story that this is, and, you know, how strong-headed that man is that the story is based on. And I know that Captain Phillips had linked in with Tom Hanks before the film. There was a little bit of that, and there was a little bit of dialogue, and that was something that really played into Tom Hanks' performance, and he was able to emulate what he had done. So that was something that was an instant connection for me. But to be honest with you, and taking all that away and talking about all that, the simple fact is, when I see Tom Hanks in a major blockbuster, 9 times out of 10, I'm going to be there. And I know a lot of you are too. Maybe that's not the case now, another 10 years later, but I don't think his aura has changed too much. His performances and his quality haven't changed too much. Even in something as most recent as Elvis, or even any of the kind of recent performances in the last few years, he still brings so much and has such a wide variety and range as an actor. And Captain Phillips is one of his shining examples. Not just in that period of time, the early 2010s, I think overall. I think if you're looking through the great Tom Hanks films, you've got the early ones, yes, and maybe the late 80s, the 90s, the 2000s. But Captain Phillips has got to be right up there. Right up there with one of his top performances. And the scenario itself, it brings it to such an... As again, I say that word, exhausting. It's an exhausting film to watch because the tension that builds throughout this from nearly the minute go, it's... Captain Phillips is brilliant. It's so good. It has so much quality. If you've seen it, you know exactly what I'm talking about. There's a reason it was one of the highest grossing films of that year, and one of the most popular and most talked about and most discussed film of that year. Captain Phillips is great. If you've seen it, you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't, give it a go. Number 4. 12 Years a Slave is directed by Steve McQueen and stars Chiwetel Ejiofor, Michael Fassbender and Brad Pitt. So as you know, if you've been following the series, 5 of the best, I always like to be upbeat when I can about these films. And of course they vary from comedies to thrilling action films or dramas and things like that. But 12 Years a Slave, like a few of the others like that, is a harrowing film. Harrowing in a way that I certainly couldn't ever relate with, but the empathy that the audience shows to this film, and the conveyance of just how really heartbreaking the scenario is so well crafted by the performances, in particular Chiwetel Ejiofor, who I think personally is one of the more underrated actors in Hollywood today. He gives so much, but it never seems to get these big roles. You don't really see him in too many massive roles. You maybe know him as something like in Doctor Strange, where he's in that. He's in a few other smaller performances, but he never gets to be the leading man. And not really, well, not never, but not really on a consistent basis. Apart from something like 12 Years a Slave. But my God, does he warrant it. Because the performance he gives, and I've said this before about some actors where they can say so much without saying a lot. You know what I mean? Like their conveyance of emotion through just facial movements or a certain look can convey so much emotion in us as audience members, and you know exactly what's going through their head without having to say it. The subtlety is there's a lot of that throughout this film, and just this I keep using that word, but heartbreaking scenario that he's in, to be taken away from his family and be put in such an awful, heartbreaking, and just it's so nice that the world has moved on for a lot of things, because 12 Years a Slave is a heartbreaking film, and is an eye-opener for a lot of people, I would imagine, for this all existed. Of course, I'm not from America, but it's certainly, people know the history. You know, we chatted about this a little while back whenever I chatted about something like The Pianist. These awful acts and awful, how horrific humanity can be. Forget about the monsters in a horror. Forget about, you know, all these scary or whatever the case may be. The scariest thing sometimes, and I actually talked about that a little bit there when we talked about Captain Phillips, the scariest thing that can... humanity can be the scariest thing of all. You know, how awful people can be without remorse. And that's what 12 Years a Slave does so well, and it conveys so well. Is it a triumph of cinema? I think in a lot of ways, yes. I think it does so much brilliant things. It is a cultural significantly film it shows so much of, you know, it doesn't hold back is probably the best way to put it. It doesn't sugarcoat anything. A bit like The Pianist a lot of those years back, when, you know, these harrowing and horrific acts that happen, they just convey it in such a sad but true way, if you get what I mean. But Chiwetel Ejiofor definitely is one of those performers that actors in a performance like this, I just think it shows why he's there. Other performances, Michael Fassbender, never has he been more hateable than in this film. I don't know if hateable is a word, but he is despicable in this film. But he, of course, does his role so well. He has that kind of Joffrey effect where he plays the role perfectly to hate, to be the antagonist, if that's even the right word in this scenario. Because it is such a real film, and of course it's based on the novel by the main character, Solomon Northup, which I suppose that's the part that rings true and certainly, you know, hits home the hardest. Of course it is it's not a work of fiction. It's an adapted screenplay, of course, but it is, yeah, the 12 Years a Slave is a hard one. It's a hard one to watch, but I think there's real quality in it, and it's hard to deny the quality of 12 Years a Slave. Obviously, it got a lot of awards at the time for that year, and it deserved every single one of them. It really is. It's another one of those films, and again, I feel like I'm saying this over and over again, but there's a few performances in here, and there's it like you could cry at just even the thought of this scenario. It's hard. It's hard to watch, but it's so good. It's so good because there is a triumph, there is a victory of the human spirit, if you like, in this film, and it's brilliantly conveyed. But the harrowing nature of it doesn't get taken away from it, and I suppose that's the hardest thing as a director and as adapting the screenplay and turning this into a motion picture makes it the hardest thing, because you have such, what would be the word? You do this slightly wrong. You slightly, push it too far this way or too far this way, and this film is a disaster. It gets labelled as, all these different things, and it just would be the opposite. This is such a finely crafted movie for what it is. Is it an enjoyable experience? I don't think I could say that. It is not that. But what it is a brilliant movie for exactly what it needs to achieve. It does it in abundance. Of course, I'm not the best person to speak on this, but I know it was well received by so many people when it came out. I watched this with my dad a lot of years back, and it was kind of a really... Because when at this time, we would have went to the cinema quite a lot, and it was not a movie... my dad was very keen on it. I don't know that I was too much, but coming out of it, it was one of those films that I always remember thinking back to as one of the first that I was like, geez, that broke my heart, but I loved it. You know what I mean? It's loving the knowledge of learning the harrowing stuff and learning to be better, I suppose. And I suppose that's the biggest message of all from 12 Years a Slave and a lot of these heartbreaking humanity stories. But yeah, 12 Years a Slave, If you're going to watch it, you need to be in the right mindset, definitely. That's a warning for now. But if you're in the right mindset, it's hard to deny the quality of this film from start to finish. It is brilliant.
Number 3.
The Conjuring is directed by James Wan and stars Patrick Wilson and Vera Farmiga. So from one horrific scenario to a horror film itself. And it's not often, as you know if you've been following the series, that horror movies don't always appear on here. But I have to tell you this, there's not many that'll appear on 5 of the Best that are stronger than The Conjuring, especially the first one. I like the second one a lot too, but the first Conjuring always sticks in my mind as one of the great horror films of the last 10 years. And you might say, well, then you've got the Conjuring universe that has things like Annabelle and The Nun and all these different spin-offs, and yes, I get it. We have that. Many times we had the conversation about saturation by sequels, which I will always describe as the Pirates of the Caribbean effect, where it starts well, has a brilliant 3 films in that case, and then just keeps going. The Conjuring has a brilliant first film, has a really good second film, and everything else is kind of meh to awful. The first Annabelle is dire. The second Annabelle, surprisingly okay, but not great. The last Annabelle, meh. The last Conjuring, the latest Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It, isn't that what it's called? It's not anywhere near the quality of the first 2 films. And The Nun is just... Does The Nun have any quality? It has none. We have fun here. But no, the Conjuring universe as a whole, not so good. But why is it a universe? Because the first film is so damn good. The first Conjuring has some of the best scares, most effective scares, and I say this all the time, and it does my head in with horror movies, and I know it probably does your head in too, but cheap jump scares are just a waste of time, and that's the sign of a terrible horror movie, because they just throw any kind of thing to get any jolt out of it. Everything in The Conjuring, the first, and a lot of the second too, the scares are earned. Is that the right? Yeah, earned? Yeah, I just said that really weird. But yeah, the scares in The Conjuring are just earned. And it's not every horror movie can say that. And they're effective. You'll probably remember the one from the trailer. When was the trailer? It's definitely over 10 years ago now. But you have that scare where she's kind of looking down into the basement. The lights have gone out. She lights a match. And then the claps go, you know that? Remember that? Like that was the kind of trailer scare, if you like. But actually, the ones in the film are so much more effective. So much more effective. The Conjuring, if I always think to myself, okay, I want to sit down and watch a horror film. And to be honest, I'm not the biggest horror lover of all time. As I said before in one of the other ones, when I was talking about Sinister, it was around this time that I really got into horror. Movies like Sinister and movies like The Conjuring and a few others, which will certainly appear in the coming years, they really moulded my love of horror. And The Conjuring, I always put at the forefront of that. Do I love it as much as something like Sinister? Maybe just slightly less. But that doesn't mean I don't love it a lot. And in the performances, Patrick Wilson as well. Patrick Wilson, who of course is also a key component of the Insidious franchise, especially the first one. And again, the first Insidious is good. It just didn't make it onto that year because I think it was a strong year of 5. Is the first Insidious as good as The Conjuring? I don't think so. But Patrick Wilson really has a knack for appearing well in these horror films, in a kind of similar role. Vera Farmiga as well. I have to say, I'm not too familiar with her work, bar like The Departed. I don't know that I've seen her in too much more, bar The Conjuring and The Departed. But she's also really good at this. Them as the Warrens, the two of them. And they're dynamic with the family, they're dynamic with trying to solve the case. I say the case like it's a detective show. the haunting, they're trying to solve the haunting. There's not a part of The Conjuring when you're checked out. It is always engaging, whether that be if you watch a horror movie just from scare to scare. You know, you build up to this scare, there was that scare, and then a bit of downtime, and then another scare. Or if you watch it for the story, and I think that's the ones where you get hooked the most. And The Conjuring is a really engaging horror story, because I think if horror is a genre, and again, I'm not maybe the best person to speak about this, but horror is a genre. I think if it's done well, if the storytelling's done well, there's so much you can do with horror. because you've got, the 15 or 18 rating, or R rating, or whatever it is in America, where you're allowed the freedom to tell the story that you need to tell. And I think that horror movies, there's so much wasted, because there is that cheap thing. And I don't really want to go into a big tirade about horror movies as a whole, because I seem like I do that every time we talk about horror movies. But The Conjuring in particular, let's go back to talking about just The Conjuring and James Wan as a director, of course, probably one of the most influential horror directors in recent times. He really has staked his claim and became one of the forefronts of horror direction, and rightly so, and he's very, very well earned. The Conjuring as a whole is just a brilliant horror movie. There's not really much more to say to that. There's a reason there was a franchise built out of this film. There's a reason that the second film is also great, because it builds and adds a lot of, in a different dynamic, I suppose, but it builds a lot of the same tension that is earned so well throughout this film. The Conjuring is so great. It's so great. If you're a horror fan, you know what I'm talking about. You know The Conjuring is so great. Is it ruined by the satirization of the sequels? I don't think so. It kind of goes back to that same point where we talk about where it's like, if the sixth film of a franchise is awful, does that make the first one not good? I don't think so. Maybe that doesn't apply to everybody, but for me personally, I think The Conjuring is great, and I would recommend it to any horror fan. And even if you're kind of wanting to dip your toe in, I think you could cope with The Conjuring. Yes, it has effective scares, and yes, you'll feel them. But I think it's worth... I think if you're wanting to start with something pretty entry-level horror, The Conjuring as a story is one of the most engaging. And I think as a movie lover and as a movie fan, I think that The Conjuring probably would provide the best entry to horror, if you get what I mean. So that's something to think about. But yeah, The Conjuring is great. If you haven't seen it already, do yourself a favour and go and watch it.
Number 2.
Prisoners is directed by Denis Villeneuve and stars Hugh Jackman, Jake Gyllenhaal, and Paul Dano. Now I want to say this straight off the bat, because you're probably thinking to yourself, I thought Prisoners might be number 1. When you get there, you'll see why it just didn't make it. However, this is one of those years where 2 and 1 were as close as they've ever been. They were so close to eclipsing each other. There was times when I had Prisoners in number 1 and number 1 in number 2. I, in the end, went for number 2 for Prisoners. But it's a coin flip. On another day, they would have changed. And why is that? Why is Prisoners so close to being number 1 of this year, and why is it so good? Prisoners is one of the most smartly written films I have ever seen. Prisoners is a heartbreaking tale, and I feel like that's the word of the day. Well, I've seen you say that quite a lot today, but it really is. Prisoners about a man who loses his daughter. I mean, that's obviously there's a lot of overarching narratives. There's the cop with Jake Gyllenhaal and things like that, but essentially what this is a man bent on revenge, hell bent on revenge for his, trying to unravel the mystery. And having the two opposing narratives, you have the cop side of things, which is Jake Gyllenhaal in one of his best ever performances, and that is no understatement either. Having him against Hugh Jackman in probably his best performance, and having them as two sides of the coin, if you like. Whereas, of course, Jake Gyllenhaal is trying to do things by the book. Yes, we'll catch the killer, we'll catch, whatever the scenario is and all that. That's it. You have that dynamic of that. Or on the flip side, you have Hugh Jackman, who is ready to murder everybody at just to get any kind of information. And of course that plays into the dynamic with him and Paul Dano's character, which I'll not obviously elaborate too much, because if you haven't seen Prisoners, you have to experience this yourself. I don't want to say too much about the movie, but the quality. And before I continue talking about performances in the movie as a whole, I want to talk a little bit about Denis Villeneuve, the director, which every time I say that name, I always think I'm saying it wrong. My French accent isn't that great, as you can probably already tell. But him as a director, is really staking his claim as one of the best in the business. And Prisoners is one of the earlier examples of this. In more recent times, we've had things like Blade Runner 2049, something like Dune, which I loved if you've been following the channel. But this shows another side, I suppose, to him, because now he's been categorized as a director who is perfect for these big sci-fi epics. Something like a Blade Runner, something like Dune, of course, are the best examples. But in Prisoners, to have such a tightly knit and so well structured and woven drama and narrative throughout this film between two opposing arcs that are trying to get the same goal in very different ways, Prisoners is borderline a masterpiece. It is so unbelievably effective in what it conveys. The desperation by the father, the trying to stay by the book of the cop in Jake Gyllenhaal, and it's just so... It is the definition of a thriller, because the whole film from start to finish is thrilling. Is it the most enjoyable film? Again, that word's a bit... It has maybe the wrong connotations, because this is a very dark and gripping drama. A very dark and gripping thriller probably is the better example of it, or description of it. I think that Prisoners is one of the most effective films that I have seen in a long time. Prisoners always sticks with me as one of those just top tier, dark and gritty films. It is a hard hitter. And again, I've said a lot about that when we talk about 12 Years a Slave, with this hard-hitting narrative. But in that's a very different dynamic. Prisoners is just... And again, this seems to be the theme of the day, but the evil of humanity. And that's what Prisoners is. Prisoners is, they're prisoners in their own town, in their own... They're trapped in the scenario that they find themselves in because of the child that's missing. Prisoners is so good. I could keep waxing lyrical, but what I worry about is saying too much and giving away any kind of plot details. And I really want you, if you haven't seen this film and you feel like you're in the right headspace to watch it, and again, it is a bit like that, it is a right headspace kind of movie, but if you are, and I feel that I was when I first watched Prisoners and rewatched it a few times since, Prisoners is fantastic. It is so good. And when we get to number one, which we're almost about to get to, but you'll see it's a very different film, a very different genre, if you like, but the quality of both films are there for all to see. There's a reason Prisoners has such a... the response it got when it came out and still has today. So many people talk about this as one of the best films they've seen in years, and it rightly is. It has so much quality. It's just so... I said this at the start, and that's how I'm going to end this part of the review, because it's just so smartly written. Prisoners is such a smart film. It takes you on the... it takes you on the road with the characters, both sides, and you feel like you're... And I've said this before, and I feel like I say this in a lot of these dramas, but it's so true. You feel like you're almost getting ahead of the characters, but the story is just one step ahead. You feel like you're about to uncover it, and the rug gets pulled. And that's brilliant storytelling. Doesn't happen all the time in cinema, but when they strike right, they strike so well. And Prisoners is one of the best examples in the last 10 or even 20 years of drama and storytelling, especially in a dark genre. Prisoners is so good. Please go and watch Prisoners if you haven't. This is one that I endorse to the highest level. And we're about to get to number one. And you're about to find out why it's number one. But it was so close. Because my number one is...
Number 1.
The Wolf of Wall Street is directed by Martin Scorsese, is based on the life of Jordan Belfort, and stars Leonardo DiCaprio, Jonah Hill, and Margot Robbie. So you see my dilemma? You see why it was so hard to choose between these two films? So very different films. The Wolf of Wall Street and Prisoners are just so different to each other. But The Wolf of Wall Street is so good. And this is no small statement, but it's one of Scorsese's best. I firmly believe that. I think The Wolf of Wall Street is a... I always struggle to use this term because I never understand if I'm using it right or not. But The Wolf of Wall Street feels iconic. It's iconic for a lot of reasons, especially for younger fellas who got introduced to Margot Robbie for the first time. But in another way, and more of a significant way, it just it reiterates the quality that Martin Scorsese has. And why he is, I wouldn't say he's undoubtedly the greatest of all time, but he's definitely in the top 1, 2, or 3 of directors. He is just far and away one of the best. And this is yet another string to his bow, if you like. A very different film to what you would usually categorize. You know, something like The Irishman is so far removed to what Wolf of Wall Street is. But they're both equally... I mean, I enjoyed Wolf of Wall Street a lot more than I enjoyed The Irishman, but it's hard to deny the quality of both of those films, but it just shows the difference of that. But there's a lot of performances in here, so let's get through a lot of them, because there's some brilliant moments that probably will, if you've seen the film, or even if you haven't seen Wolf of Wall Street, you've seen the clips. Something like the Matthew McConaughey scene when they're in the restaurant, Cal Chandler as the, you know, kind of the cop who, again, I suppose kind of tied it back to what we're talking about Prisoners, where he feels like he's getting ahead of Jordan Belfort and Leonardo DiCaprio's character, and he's just always one step ahead. I mean, there's so much of that. But the kind of the core three, the three that I remember really making me love this film. First of all, let's talk about Jonah Hill, because not that long ago, I was talking and waxing lyrical about Jonah Hill, along with a few other performances, in Superbad, and also in 21 Jump Street, in 2 great comedies. So for him to come into a role like this, and don't get me wrong, The Wolf of Wall Street is a very funny film. Like, you could classify this as a comedy. There's hilarious moments. And most of them actually stem from Jonah Hill. So he comes in with that comedic prowess that he has from those films, and those kind of, what I always talk about, that really defining era for me of comedies, that kind of 2008 to 2012, whatever it may be. But Jonah Hill is, as Donnie in this, is just, his dynamic with Leonardo DiCaprio is hilarious in most times. He's kind of the worst influence on him, and it's just, it's. I find myself just the more I talk about this, I want to just go and watch The Wolf of Wall Street, and I suppose that's probably why I put it first, because even thinking about The Wolf of Wall Street, it's one of those films that I just adore. I just love so much. It's a fun watch. Yes, it's maybe one of the lengthier films that we've talked about, but it earns it. And I suppose we do talk about that sometimes, when films don't need to be longer, don't need to have this long run time. They can be trimmed down 15, 20, 30 minutes. Wolf of Wall Street isn't that. It's the perfect length. It perfectly does exactly what it needs to. It's just, and I suppose engaging is the best word to use, because from the start, this tale of someone who is kind of what feels like on top of the world, loses their job, becomes nothing, and has to make everything for themselves, in Jordan Belfort, of course played by Leonardo DiCaprio, who we'll get to in a little minute, and then becomes this global entrepreneurial masterclass. He just, it's such a brilliant, and also it makes you, like, it doesn't talk to you like you're stupid. It explains very well to the audience and conveys very well to the audience how this is being done, this kind of insider trading loophole, if you like, that they use and use and abuse to get themselves very rich, to make Stanton Oakmont, and that kind of leads to all the hilarity, the madness, the craziness that unfolds throughout, especially kind of the middle act of the film and leading into the final act. And I suppose a big part of the second and third act is Margot Robbie, and this was, of course, for what I mentioned earlier, the memorable parts of Margot Robbie, but also she also shows so much quality as an actress that led on to so much for her. up to as recent as not that long ago in something like Babylon, where she continues to just show her quality as an actress. And I suppose this is the one that when people think back to, where did you first see Margot Robbie, or what was her first performance that made you take notice? And it was this one. For younger fellas, there's a certain reason, but for people who love the movies, there's a different reason, and it's what she brings to the role. She is fantastic. But let's talk about the main man, who I've talked about so many times at this point on 5 of the Best, and that's Leonardo DiCaprio. And I get to say, yet again, that Leonardo DiCaprio is great. How many times have I said that now? Even in the last 4 or 5 years, he's appeared in some form or another. Way back to like 2006, 2004, he has appeared in 5 of the Best, maybe the most of any actor at this point. And you might say, oh, but he's in good movies, and you know, he is the man. Leonardo DiCaprio is still the man all those years later, but he's so good as Jordan Belfort. You might see that clip, and it always kind of sticks in my head. It's not actually part of the movie. It's an outtake of, you know, it kind of shows Scorsese directing, and you see Leonardo DiCaprio about to start into his line. It's when they're in the office. You might remember this, but you know, the big wide open space office, and he has this kind of monologue where he's talking about, was this legal? Absolutely not. You know the scene I'm talking about. But it kind of leads into that. But it shows Leonardo DiCaprio he stands face down, doesn't say anything, and then you hear action, and he just straight into the character. Everything is just beat by beat. He's one of the best. One of the best. He definitely is. One of the best in 5 of the Best, because he's appeared so much. He's one of our 5 of the Best Hall of Famers at this point, because he is everywhere, he earns it. It's not like it's a fluke. It's not like he doesn't deserve to be here. It's not like he doesn't deserve that leading man continuation of roles that he gets all the time, because he's worthy of them. And to be honest, there's not many DiCaprio films that I can think of personally, even way back to something like Catch Me If You Can or Titanic, all the way through to Wolf of Wall Street, or there's so many more in the coming years after this, and it will certainly. This is probably the most obvious spoiler for the upcoming videos. Leonardo DiCaprio will appear again in 5 of the Best. I don't even think I wrote the following ones yet, but I know he'll be there because it's a sure bet. Because he's always there, and he always brings just so. It's kind of silly how good Leonardo DiCaprio is in nearly everything he does. It's kind of unfair. It's a bit selfish of him. But yeah, back to the film. Wolf of Wall Street is one of the most fun, mad, crazy, memorable films, iconic films of maybe any decade, never mind in recent times. Wolf of Wall Street is so good. You know that already. I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, because if you haven't, who hasn't seen Wolf of Wall Street at this point? If you haven't somehow magically have not seen Wolf of Wall Street, do yourself the biggest favour and sit down and enjoy the madness that ensues. It's so good, it's so enjoyable, and it's one of the it's the reason why it's the best film of this year. So that has been the year 2013, and I'm going to say what I always say, and you're going to go, he says this every time, but this has been another great year. It has. You can't deny that. Like, even the honourable mention. Let's do what we always do. Let's talk about the honourable mentions and who were close to breaking into the top 5, because that is a solid top 5. Because some of the years there's like the top 2 or top 3 are always set in stone, but then the 4 and 5, or even just the 5, can chop and change, and some can maybe break into that top 5. There was a lot in 2013, but I don't think any of them nearly broke into the top 5, to be honest with you. The top 5 was set very early whenever I was looking at this. But there's some great honourable mentions, and I suppose if I'm going through the list of which ones were closest, maybe something like Lone Survivor, very close to breaking in there. Great Gatsby as well. Leonardo DiCaprio again. Let me, that man. What can't he do? Dallas Buyers Club, I know, got a lot of Academy acclaim. I enjoyed it, but don't think I loved it as much as a lot of people did. it's hard to deny the quality of it, of course, but I don't think I enjoyed it, again, as I say, as much as some others did. The World's End, the end of the Cornetto trilogy, and suppose the forgotten one. You've got Shaun of the Dead, which of course I've covered, which is brilliant. Hot Fuzz, which I've covered, which is also brilliant. And The World's End, while it maybe isn't, not even maybe, it isn't as good as Hot Fuzz or Shaun of the Dead, it is also very enjoyable in its own right. And I think if you love that kind of comedy, the Shaun of the Dead or Hot Fuzz comedy, and you want a bit of a palate cleanser, and you don't want to go and watch Paul because... do you remember that movie, Paul, with Seth Rogen as the alien? Yeah, there's a reason there's a Cornetto trilogy and that's not included. The World's End's a good palate cleanser, it's good, it's enjoyable as well. On the horror side of things, the Evil Dead remake was also really good, and it kind of introduced me to that franchise, because it was a bit before my time, I have to admit. And lastly, something like Her. Joaquin Phoenix, of course, has had bigger roles since, you could argue, but that's also another great film. Was it close to breaking into the top 5? Not really. But yeah, the top 5 was pretty set. Something like Captain Phillips was always going to be in there because of it was definitely the most memorable film of this year, bar something like Wolf of Wall Street, I think. Or I suppose Conjuring was also, on the horror side of things, was also very memorable, and it's still memorable today. So 10 years ago, we're getting close to... There's not be too long, and then we'll be up to date with these 5 of the best. But yeah, 2013 is always a year that, and again, you're going to go, he says this every time, but it is a year I look back on so fondly, and the reason is mainly for those top 2, even top 3 films. Wolf of Wall Street, of course. Everybody, even if you haven't seen it and you didn't want to know anything about it, people know about the Wolf of Wall Street, and most people have seen it. Prisoners, I don't think as many people would have seen, but if you haven't, again, go and just experience Prisoners. It is an experience. And The Conjuring as well. Conjuring it's one of the more cultural significant horror films in recent memory, for sure, definitely in the last 10 years or even the last 15 years. It's definitely one of the most memorable ones and definitely the most influential. I suppose maybe The Conjuring, Insidious, I would say Sinister, maybe it's not as memorable as some of these other ones, but definitely one of the better ones. But yeah, overall 2013's been a great year. Will next year be better though? I actually think it might be, because I always remember that 2014, I think it's like 2014 and 2017, maybe it's 2019, something like that, but there's a few years of this decade that I remember, like, see when the way at the start of this video there was the honourable mentions, and it was like, and there's this, and there's this, and there's this, and usually, if you think back to whenever 5 of the best started, I think the first 5 of the best for the year 2000, there was like 2 honourable mentions? Was it 3 maybe? This year we had, let me just count them, 8, 9, 10? I don't know, that was just a quick guess. It could have been more than that, it could have been less than that. But I'm telling you, some of these years coming up, there will be honourable mentions where it's like, Jesus, this guy's writing a novel of honourable mentions. But just think, if there's that many honourable mentions, how good quality is the top 5? Let's see. But if you have enjoyed this video, as always, I really appreciate you sticking around and listening to me talking about the movies. If you did enjoy this one, leave a like, let me know. If you want to subscribe and stick around, I'd appreciate you so much for doing that. And if you do, I will hopefully see you in the next one. Bye, guys. Thanks for taking the time to watch this video. Before you go, here are some of my other videos. For updates and information on upcoming videos, the best place to find us is my Twitter. Much love, everyone.